Welcome to the Binge Thinker podcast.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Sam.
The two of us enjoy meeting up to discuss the things that interest us.
We'll be focusing on topics concerning science, philosophy, culture and politics.
And we hope you find this discussion as interesting as we did. In this episode, we look at pseudoscientific thinking.
We talk about some examples of pseudoscience, why people believe them, and how to address anti-scientific thinking. Any conversation about pseudoscience and anti-scientific thinking, I think we have to start by going back into history and looking at how the general population would tend to approach all manners of different phenomena by using non-scientific explanations.
Yeah, there's a firstly, scientific principles aren't really that old, but even before the codification of how we falsify and test hypotheses, things went through lots and lots of cycles of building on ideas, believing them for a long time, and then rejecting them.
Yeah,
basic phenomena.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at it as almost a timeline of how things have changed. But I think something else that's equally as fascinating is how, even though broadly speaking we've come so far in some ways, like you could say in the West, mainly, well, near enough the world over, but mainly in the West, there is a general trend towards scientific thinking, towards empiricism. But then, like I say, equally as fascinating is the fact that some pseudosciences and some anti-scientific ways of thinking have apparently persisted over great periods of time, and even to this day, with all the evidence and convincing, elegant theories and attempts to increase scientific literacy, and you've still got large numbers of people that embrace non-scientific thinking.
It's definitely not a thing that's gone away. But
it's not totally gone away.
No, it's definitely to a lesser extent. So maybe we should define kind of our understandings of what pseudoscience is before we go any further then.
Yeah, so, well, I'll have a crack at it. Let's see if you agree. Yeah, so pseudoscience is, I mean, this is not the dictionary definition, but essentially a belief system that it's usually a coherent belief system that tries to explain certain phenomena or suggests that there are certain phenomena that exist using what appear to be scientific reasoning, but in fact, on closer inspection or using empirical methods, turn out to have very little or no basis in science whatsoever.
Yeah, I'd say that's very good. I mean, the only very small thing I'd add to it is sometimes with the pseudoscientific conclusions and concepts that people have come up with, they're not actually bad science, they're just incomplete science, where a conclusion's been drawn off only a few principles, which we then later on discover don't actually have the conclusions that were initially drawn.
Yeah.
And I imagine we'll get into quite a few of the examples of those as we go on.
So when you think of pseudoscience, there's plenty of examples. I mean, just looking at a cursory glance online at all the different, you search pseudoscience and you see what comes up, and there's so many that you can't believe that there's so many more than I even knew about. Lots of different systems from all over the world that are ways of explaining phenomena or ideas about things that exist, like certain energies or that certain things that exist possess magical properties.
Yeah. The whole side of it with this like esoteric nonsense, but then there's also a scientific side, well, pseudo-scientific side of it as well, I guess, isn't
it? I think, and just kind of adding to the definition is, a crucial point is that what differentiates it from just pure nonsense fairy tale magic is that pseudosciences, there is at least a general attempt to try and be explanatory. Yeah. That there is a general
framework. There's a general appeal to logic, it's just not necessarily complete.
Either not complete or not scientific. Yeah. Like, a lot of them appeal to emotions. I mean, we'll get into again, like, why people might want to believe pseudoscience or what's attractive about pseudoscience. But yeah, so just to go through a couple of examples up front. So you've got things like reiki, like spirit healing, that believes that there's this universal life force energy. The interesting thing about it being a pseudoscience is that, and about it appealing to logic, is that as a kind of very rudimentary understanding of how the universe works. And a lot of the time, a lot of pseudosciences have a basis in eras before we embrace scientific reasoning and have just persisted past our growing knowledge of it. But if you think about Reiki, for example, there's this idea that all living things have inside them a universal energy, the thing that differentiates us between, chairs or rocks or
but from my understanding also is the principle that connects all things as well, isn't it, with Reiki?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we're all
channeling of this energy that you can achieve what to me I would call traditionally magic, like getting things done without work.
Yeah.
It's a traditional sense of magic, but in this sense it's often applied into medical situations.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the whole point, what really appeals to people is that you're using some of the wonder of the universe, some of these, well, the universe does have inherent wonder. There's all sorts of questions that people don't know the answers to, many questions that people don't know the answers to, and it's a kind of a way of trying to understand that, but unfortunately not embracing science to achieve that end.
Yeah. It's kind of going there half the yard. And
exactly, yeah.
Through.
And just this idea that you can channel energy into somebody who's sick, or even in some cases they have horrible diseases like cancer, and there's a belief among some people that this energy that cannot be proven, bearing in mind well, it's not that it can't, that's poor phrasing. What I mean is it hasn't been proven under experimental conditions, and I'll pop the link in the description of some research that I found on Reiki specifically, that showed that when compared to placebo, there was a similar, essentially zero effect in both cases. It doesn't. It's not statistically significantly different from placebo. So and despite these attempts at trying to work out whether or not these things have any basis, despite them coming up negative again and again,
people still believe
it
in the face of obvious evidence.
Absolutely. So I've mentioned Reiki. Another one's homeopathy.
Yeah. Richard Dawkins has a lot to say on that one.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic little documentary if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I will link it up. I'll need to look into that. But so homeopathy, the idea that diluting certain substances can be diluted
to increase their strength.
Or water, exactly. Or water that's been in contact with things has.
It's the idea that water maintains a memory of the chemicals used in it.
It's amazing, really.
So let's say you were to have an antiviral drug to a person who believes in homeopathy. Drinking water that's been diluted is stronger than taking a pill of the exact same antiviral, whatever the medicine.
So
is.
in the case,
but just to go one further, because I found this absolutely fascinating. With that, I'll have to look up and link in the actual statistic of how often these things are diluted.
Yeah.
But it gets to the point after this dilution that when you go to the shop to buy this medicine, it doesn't contain a single atom of the original medicine.
That's amazing, isn't it? But I'm just saying that in terms of, that's not just a lack of scientific principle. That's actually going in the other direction. That's a rejection of what we understand to be true.
There's this fantastic joke about a homeopathic patient who forgot to take his medication and died.
All right.
Because it was so strong.
So that's homeopathy. Again, from my understanding, there is. I'll pop some more research in about this in the description. There is no evidence that there is any active properties, any beneficial properties to using homeopathic medicine above placebo. Apparently, if you believe it.
Yeah, there are some complications that we can get on to talking about, but in terms of the actual medicine itself and the quote-unquote science as it's put forward, there is no merit that's been found in research.
Yeah, absolutely. So
there are things to be said about increased patient-doctor time and stuff, but we can get onto that a bit later.
And then, so that's Reiki, homeopathy. We've got astrology as well, another popular one.
Massively.
I mean, it's in the newspapers.
Yeah, I mean, like every single week.
But I wonder if it's tongue in cheek. I don't think like people who make these newspapers.
It's not for the people who read it, though. I don't think.
Maybe not. But I don't. Do you really think that the people who produce the newspapers really think that they're offering a service? They're like, this is. Well, maybe they believe it's a service in the sense that the people that believe it see it as a service. But like, surely.
I don't know. I mean, what if the person writing it's a believer? I mean, and there used to be, what was it? It's like astrologers to the stars and stuff who were hired experts in astrology who would predict the horoscope, for example. Well, I mean, this is I don't know an example off by heart, but let's say Elton John might hire a personal horoscoper. There's a word I've just made up. It sounds fantastic.
I like it. Yeah,
absolutely brilliant.
It's got a good flow.
I'm going into business with that one. Who would follow him around and maybe give him a weekly horoscope and stuff. So there's some real genuine belief about
I don't doubt that
how the location of stars has an impact on.
Yeah, I don't doubt that there are lots of people out there who genuinely believe that these statements that they read about the positions of stars and celestial bodies actually have some basis on what's going to happen for them in the next month, and whether or not they're going to come into financial gain or they're going to meet a loved one. If you could imagine that this
sounds a lot like a fortune cookie, doesn't it? Really,
but it's amazing that in the heads of the people who believe this, and I don't mean to just be completely, overly harsh to people who believe it, but they genuinely believe that the position of the celestial bodies and the stars, something that's very far removed from us, can actually have some bearing on whether or not they're going to find love in the next month. It's amazing that they can believe that there is a connection.
Obviously heard of myths and rumours about the effects of phases of the moon on people's psyche and stuff, and that's often been attributed and misattributed to certain things, but one of the most prevalent ideas is the idea of tidal forces, and we're made of lots of water, so maybe there's a pull there. It doesn't work like that. There's fantastic
That's classic pseudoscience though.
Man, yeah, so that's a perfect example. So there's that's built on lots and lots of facts, actual true facts. But then the conclusion,
the interpretation of those facts,
jumps a step. It's all there until the very last stage.
Yeah, it is true.
Made.
It is true that the moon has an effect on the tides of the earth. It is true that the seas are made of the same thing, or that we're composed of.
Yeah.
So these building blocks that you make the final assumption on, and this is probably true of all sorts of pseudosciences, the building blocks of it to draw people in to the way of thinking. To the dogma of it, is that these building blocks that the final jump assumption is made on are true.
Well, this is the perfect example to bring us on to what we're going to talk about next, in that these ideas don't come from nowhere. It seems to be based on our inherent ability, maybe quote unquote there, to look for patterns, recognise patterns, and draw conclusions from them, whether or not they be right or wrong.
Absolutely, we'll go into that shortly. And then another one that I think worth mentioning, because it's just different, is Feng Shui. Have you heard of that? Or Feng Shui? I don't know how you pronounce it, but
Feng Shui is how I've heard it.
Yeah, Feng Shui, which is the idea that in a room, I think this is a really interesting one actually. Just when you pick something apart and try and think why it is the case that it exists. So like the idea that a room or a space, your living space, can have sort of a good harmony and like a good energy to it, like a sort of good vibes or bad vibes. And I was thinking the other day about this actually, while planning for the podcast, that what is it inside us that has, what is it in our mental, in our psyche that's caused this particular flavour of pseudoscience to come into being. And I was thinking it's a very strange kind of specific way of thinking, but I thought our visual systems, and this is again getting into the idea of why pseudoscience is why it's attractive to some people. But our visual system, humans, the way we've evolved is we have evolved to appreciate symmetry in other humans, because it's an indication of health, reproductive health,
and good genes
and that sort of thing. And I was wondering if maybe Feng Shui is a misfiring of our tendency to appreciate like visual symmetry and almost appreciate beauty in the visual. So it's a misfiring of our ability to appreciate beauty.
I don't think it's necessarily as complicated as that. I've seen, doing like little bits of research into, very small bits of research into Feng Shui. I mean internet research, not studies, by the way, just to make that abundantly clear. Seeing images of feng shuied house compared to just my house, and they look good. Like, I mean, they just look aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah.
I don't think I mean, obviously we can go down the route of saying maybe anything that's aesthetically pleasing comes from an evolutionary bringing up of things that are beneficial to our survival. But if we're to just go from just kind of a modern perspective, they just generally look nice. Things are tidy, and there's usually a good balance of light and.
Yeah, I wonder if now this is something that we're going to have to look into. I don't really want to go into too much of a tangent, but I wonder if part of what makes a feng shuied room, if that's the correct word, a room that's been arranged in accordance with the positive rules of feng shui, if you like, I wonder if part of what makes it look good to us at its base, at its foundation, is its functionality. So would a room, is it necessarily the case that a room that looks better than another one, for example, is an indication of how easy and how convenient and how much that room facilitates easy living?
Well, there is one of the concepts in feng shui is it to do with the flow of energy rather than like inviting good or bad energy. Like you said, it's to do with having like a path for energy to flow through your house, so the windows and light and stuff like that.
I didn't actually know that.
So that would obviously maybe translate into having wide open spaces and areas
that's
you can
functional.
walk through. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Functionality and balance.
I think feng shui is maybe a bit of a strange one because obviously there's
but again,
quite a heavy pseudoscience kind of aspect to it. But I think there also might just be a fitting and co-evolution of some kind of spiritual ideas fitting in with what actually makes a functional and aesthetically pleasing house, and they just happen to go together,
and
which would maybe suggest why it's taking off in the West so much.
And that's why, and that's why it fits so well into the definition of pseudoscience, because again, it seems to be based on
something.
There are some sturdy foundations about feng shui, and that it's is it feng shui actually?
Yeah, I think we started by saying feng shui and we've moved to feng shui somehow.
I think we know what we mean. That's the important thing. But so again, it's classic pseudoscience because when you look into it, there is some form of structure of sense, that there is logic to it, and I just think that the leap that it makes, that is a leap too far maybe, is that there's some, there's an assumption, there's an assertion that there's something otherworldly about it, that there's some sort of energy or
that you can bring into your mundane kind of existence.
And it's my understanding that along with the other examples that we've given, that there is no evidence for any such energy and really what we're actually talking about is just
good
housekeeping and functional arrangement of items and tasteful visual arrangements and colour choice and that sort of thing. So I mean, those are the examples that I've got down. There's literally, I think there's hundreds. I mean, I looked online. We could talk for 3 or 4 hours about all the different types of things. Yeah, I mean, I picked the ones: homeopathy, reiki, astrology, feng shui, all that kind of thing. I picked those because they're popular. Most people have heard of them, and but yeah, that's so popular pseudosciences. And then, I think really putting like a psychological slant on it and really digging a little bit deeper. I want to look into why it is that these pseudosciences, we've actually touched on it already with feng shui, but what is it about the human psyche that makes us come to these conclusions even when they apparently lack evidence?
I think one of the evidence is a good word to start me off on a little bit of a spiel and tangent here. That I think quite a lot of it comes down from the inherent complexity of everything. How everything is very, very complex. If you go deep enough, you can usually carry on down a whole wormhole about most subjects. And to find the actual answer quite often takes quite a lot of research and independent looking into things. And I think for quite a lot of the time, people don't have the time to go to those things. Let's take an example like some kind of awful disease, like some autoimmune disease or cancer or something. It's a bewildering subject, and we're still working out how they work, and even more troublesome, we're still working out how to cure them and things.
Absolutely.
We've got some tentative little fingers out. We're trying things with gene editing and radiotherapy and stuff, but it all seems a bit kind of like esoteric and highbrow and quite confusing to the common person I would have assumed.
Which is probably because it is complex. By
Exactly.
nature. It seems complex because it is, right?
Let's imagine you have a person with one of these. It doesn't even need to be that severe, to be fair. Let's talk about back pain.
Okay.
For example. Person's got very bad back pain. They've gone to the doctor. The doctor's asked them 1,000 questions, given them different options. They're maybe not feeling necessarily satisfied with the service they've got, or the treatments they've been given don't seem to be having any effect. And then your friend tells you about this method her friends use in this group they get together with called reiki, in which you can channel through meditative practices this energy that will open up chakras and produce natural healing and all these kind of new age buzzwords.
And it draws the person in as well, because allegedly anyone can be a healer.
Exactly.
So you've got and you know what, actually while you've been speaking, I realised something quite important about this, right? If you go to the doctor and you've got a problem, and this could be one of the reasons why Reiki and homeopathy and alternative medicine, as it's called, is attractive to people. If you go to the doctor and you say, I'm suffering from this issue, we know in the UK GPs are quite stretched, and it's quite, sometimes it can be quite difficult depending on where you live in the country. It's quite difficult to see them. So generally speaking, when you go to your doctors, if you live in quite a populated area, your appointment is short. And it's
15 minutes,
and it's very functional. It's look, right, what's wrong with you? Explain quickly what's your issue. Okay, it's this. Right, this is what I suggest. Here's a prescription. Nip to the chemist, get that pill, and take it for this amount of time. Okay, thank you. Next.
Yeah.
I think that what you miss about that is the community feel to it. When you were describing Reiki just then,
yeah, I was exactly.
It draws you in as being sort of a, I think the personal attention element of Reiki is one of its greatest strengths.
100%.
And you know what, actually, this is kind of going against the grain of what we're saying, but when Reiki has been shown, quote unquote, to have a positive effect, if there is anything positive to say about it, which the research says that there's no empirical evidence that it does anything, when compared to placebo, but what it does have going for it is its community element. It's it makes people feel, it's like personal attention, which is sometimes a little bit difficult when you contrast it to the impersonal nature.
So I can actually tie that down to a bit of evidence. The Richard Dawkins documentary on homeopathy that I mentioned. One of the things they looked into was how people would go with ailments. We've just discussed that the medicine you are given in homeopathy is a lie. It does not have any healing properties.
Essentially water.
Whatsoever. It is the liquid version of a sugar pill. Ergo,
it's placebo.
Yeah. It is 100% placebo. But one of the things they noticed was when they go to these things, you spend massive amounts of time with the doctor. Like your initial appointment might be a couple of hours.
Really? A couple of hours?
And then you have follow-up visits with the same doctor. Not for that long, but let's say half an hour or so.
We're getting into...
But people report that they feel better.
Yeah.
I think that is definitely a factor that should be investigated.
We're getting into the territory here of why it is that, again, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but we're getting into the territory here of why it is that talking therapies work.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of that.
Which is maybe a conversation we should mostly save for another time.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just wanted to say that there's a pretty strong parallel that's worth mentioning here. That I remember I studied it at uni. We were looking into why it is. So it has been established. The research shows that talking therapies like CBT do actually work. We're looking into why is it the case that they work, and one of the theories around it was quite literally just that there's personal attention. You're meeting somebody on weeks, like you say, for an hour or more, rather than the 15-minute slot you get at the GP.
100%.
And you've got personal attention, someone actually listening to you,
and taking your condition seriously.
So like I say, although we are quite clearly not supporting homeopathy and Reiki as ways of dealing with physical ailments, if there is anything good to be said about them, then maybe that personal attention is. And just getting back to the whole point of the section of the podcast that we're in now, is that can be one of the reasons why people are pulled into it. That's why people believe it. I was
going to say, to tie the loop, we aren't saying everything about every pseudoscience is absolutely ridiculous. There quite often is something there in the background that actually is genuinely useful. It's just it's surrounded by this aura of nonsense. Essentially, it's splitting those bits out is the important part.
Yeah. So, like you say, the personal attention thing, and just to kind of focus in on that point of things being bewilderingly complex for people, is that, I think this is just worth mentioning with regard to explaining it, is that we are by our nature pattern spotting creatures, right? And there's a phenomenon that's fairly well understood, and it's probably happened to you. It happens to everyone that you know. When you see a face in something, that you're walking past, you're walking past some bark, you get like bark chippings on the floor, and you swear that you see a face. You catch it for a split second, and you look, and you can actually make a face out of the bark chippings.
Famously in clouds.
In clouds, all of this kind of thing. Yeah, it's called illusory pattern perception, and it's completely healthy. And it's just the way that this links into the pseudoscience is that in this ridiculously complex world, that the more you look into it, apparently the more complex it is. It seems to be the nature. Our brains, as they are meaning machines, trying to make sense of it all, are looking at these patterns, these various different streams of information that come into us, and are grasping at meaning, trying to make meaning out of it, and along with. So you can see how you can be drawn into it. You've got the personal attention that we just mentioned, and then you offer up some things that make broad sense, like that we were using the definition of pseudoscience. There's some hand-wavy, speculative, kind of intuitive feeling that it makes sense.
It doesn't need to make complete sense, because the idea as a whole is palatable. Potentially better analogy than seeing faces and things and recognizing patterns would be the way the human eye works. We see most of what we see fine, we take it all in, the information comes in, but there is also a huge blind spot in our eye that we don't notice, because we fill it in. It doesn't matter, we'll fill it in from all the stuff around. It doesn't really matter that bit is explained. We can work something out, and I feel like that's the way quite a lot of pseudosciences will work.
Like you'll tend to find that in these things, Sam Harris described it as hermetically sealed discourse, where you get the basic tenets of the idea, the basic assertions that that there is this form of energy, or whatever it is that the pseudoscience is, and then to explain, there's usually a manner, a pretty much a catch-all way of dealing with criticism of it, or like you say, explaining away the uncertainties by kind of hand-waving its way into not being important or something like that. Or rather, and it's very basic, this goes for religion as well, is I think some people just write it off as being based on faith. That's another way of looking at it as well. Like, when it comes down to it, some people really just believe things because they want to, and that's a good enough reason.
Obviously that could be compounded by people having been given facts that don't seem to have worked for them, being told what they have and what their treatment should be, and that not having any effect. Probably going to lead to a rejection of those ideas in favour of something else that maybe has less explanation but requires less of an investment. I can just believe in this idea and hopefully it'll work for us. There's definitely a thing to be said about
it's like giving up. Giving up is like, we there's no way I could possibly understand it in its absolute depth. This is probably subconscious, actually. There's no way I could understand it in its absolute depth. So I'm choosing to use this way of thinking about it. Right. So stepping away from the individual belief in pseudoscientific ideas, if you take a step back, then I think we should look into a broader societal trend of rejecting experts' opinion, people whose lives have been devoted to studying particular things. They really have put many, many years of their lives and become deeply educated on these ideas, and they have empirical backing. They've done research themselves, most likely. They've covered every aspect of the topic from every angle, and yet their views on things are dismissed out of hand. And it's not, and like I say about the individual, you might have one individual who prefers to do reiki, that's looking at it at the individual level. But I think we should really talk about how there seems to be a trend, possibly even growing. I think you could say it is growing in some of the examples that I'm going to go through now. But yeah, I think so. Just to kind of paint this picture, one thing we can talk about is flat earthers. I think that's one thing we can talk about, and I know for a fact that is growing. There's young Earth creationism, just two examples. But yeah, the idea that the Earth is flat, and there's this kind of this almost enjoyment, a kind of indulgence in the idea that experts in society are somehow, I mean, it's conspiratorial to an extent, especially in Flat Earth, where, you know, these people whose job it is and who've spent most of their life looking into it are wrong or
lying
or maliciously lying. And on top of that, instead of, you know, taking the advice of these people whose job it is to look into it, people will fashion themselves. They consider themselves as having knowledge above these people. But again, you know, tying it into the pseudoscience topic of the podcast,
the snowballing effect of that is you end up with whole societies of people who aren't necessarily even basically educated on these ideas, forming groups
they genuinely
people.
believe. I mean, you know, Facebook's a bad place for it as well, but you've got ideas of people who have never done any formal education in some of these ideas. So I mean, another one that comes to mind is anti-vaccination, or the idea that vaccines cause autism. And then you've got, like I say, Flat Earth and Young Earth creationism. I mean, it's spectacular, really, because using just Young Earth creationism for an example, one of our favourites being religiously based.
Can you say what it is?
So Young Earth creationism is the idea that, so, you know, creationism in its basic form is the idea that a god, generally the one I'm describing is the God of Abraham, created the earth, like by hand, crafted it, and also created everything on the earth. So, you know, humans were created in God's image. You know, the whole religious shtick that people go through. So that's creationism, but a particular brand of creationism is the idea of Young Earth creationism, which it's my understanding that it comes from studying the Bible and taking its words so literally that if you add up all the ages of people in the chronological order, if you know put the Bible in chronological order and count back and add together all of the lifespans of all the people that are detailed in it, and, you know, even taking into account the overlaps and everything, right the way back
to a timeline of about 6,000 years.
So you go right the way back to Adam and Eve, which were the first humans, quote unquote, you know, as it is said in the Bible. Then they come to the conclusion that the Earth is around 6,000 years old. I've heard 4,000. I've heard, but I think 6,000 is the general agreed. Again, we'll put links to articles and research things that, so we're not misleading anyone.
Well, that's fascinating, then, isn't it? Because I mean, that is following. I mean, the Bible, regardless of any kind of deistic divine origin, is an anthropological history of certain events. So I'm definitely said they're definitely the development of some ideas. So to a degree, it is a historical document. So I guess there is an argument you could, under very timid processes, use it to try and date certain things, but to try and date the Earth obviously requires a large leap of faith to the accuracy of this one undisprovable document.
I just think that it's not even like, if you, again, it's at least within the definition of pseudoscience, you've got this kind of at least an appeal to broad logic, which in this case is the idea that you can add together ages to get the age of the Earth. It's not so much that, it's the logic that it has to dismiss as false in order to be true. That's what really gets...
It's not just discovering a stream of facts. You are deliberately going against the flow of evidence.
And the evidence is so massive. So, like I say, I mean, the examples that we know a lot about and that I think we should talk about here and use as our primary examples are, like I say, Young Earth creationism, which I've covered, evolution, which is a fantastic topic. We can talk more on that in future. It's a massive topic.
A whole series.
But you know, you have people who will go against the experts. So you've got, you know, pseudoscientific thinking of the individual, and then you've got huge communities of people, you know, quite numerous really, who, despite this fantastically elegant theory of evolution, will have to, you know, to make it fit in with their worldview, with this pseudoscientific idea that humans and animals were all created as they are now. They have to deny just the most compelling evidence of any, near enough the most compelling evidence of any theory that's ever been created.
It's like a fantastically obnoxious and counterproductive statement that how can you believe in evolution? It's just far too simple. There is no way things could happen. There's no way the human could come around through chance. Like, well, it's not simple. That's the whole point. It's pretty much the most complex thing we've ever found on this universe.
Yeah, and I think going back to the previous part of this podcast is, I think, when we're talking about why pseudoscientific or an appreciation for anti-scientific thinking comes about, it's perceived complexity of that applies to evolution, but in Flat Earth Society, I don't think that's really that's not the case.
Well, not looked massively into Flat Earth Society, but I've had a little bit of a look at it. And it seems to be that the things that are proclaimed to be true sound, I mean, based on my own kind of common sense, not necessarily applying to anyone else, but seem less likely than the current explanations.
Oh yeah.
Like for there to be a ring of ice that goes around the whole world and is just held there for some unknown reason, and for some reason every other body in the sky is a sphere except us.
I mean, how is it that there can be that many flat earthers, and like, would we not have photo evidence of the edge at least?
Yeah, but they don't trust it. Well, this is really interesting. You see, there's a group of flat earthers who are planning to fund an expedition to the edge of the world. I cannot wait. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, they'll end up back where they started.
Well, they won't, because they're going to get kidnapped by NASA and thrown in a dungeon, so they can't tell anyone what happened. It's obviously the way it's going to work out. But man, it's just, I don't know. I mean, for a vague link back to what we were saying, I think specifically with flat earthers and huge communities like that, do you think a part of it is the community? It's a part of being a part of something whole.
I've had this thought before.
Cultish?
I've had this thought before about how people. I think there's a desire to be in a group of people that are privy to some sort of information that's secret. Like
you want to be in a group, but you want to be in a selective group.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's exclusive. You know the truth. Only you know the truth. You and your in crowd. You know the truth. Everyone else is misled. And that's definitely, I'm telling you now, you brought that up, that's a good point, because that is absolutely part of it. There's this kind of, like you say, cult-like community of people that take pleasure in dismissing what is apparent, it's very, very good scientific evidence against their claims. Yeah. And, we should go taking the psychology angle again, is we know that when people are presented with evidence against something they believe quite strongly, they tend to they double down instead of so you've got that against people coming out of it. I suppose if people get pulled into that world before they are fully scientifically literate, then those social forces of being privy to special information and being part of a selective group will keep them inside before they have the chance to learn the real science.
I think I could probably attest to that slightly anecdotally. I know when I was younger, I used to love conspiracy theories. I found them absolutely amazing. Now every single time I see anything on them, I just instantly cringe.
Yeah, you want to know what's really interesting about the Flat Earth thing?
Go on.
If somebody became like a figurehead in the Flat Earth Society community, then let's say it was their job, they have a YouTube channel or whatever it is, and it becomes their job to produce content on it, right? They would inadvertently have to become very knowledgeable about the claims that NASA make. And the more and more they look into this, I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't eventually realize actually the stuff, the correct. We would, correct is a strong word, but as far as
you're saying that their opinion might change because they find all.
I'm just saying the deeper that someone gets into it, to the point where they really are trying to prove that the Earth is flat, I feel like, because we know, with as much scientific certainty as we know pretty much anything that the Earth is in fact a sphere, because lots of things have to be the case for that to be true.
It's not a one-moded experiment.
There's lots of disciplines. Lots of disciplines that fit in for it to be the case. It seems as if the more that they would get into that world, and the more that they have to try and prove that the Earth is flat, the more they're actually going to find, in fact, that the Earth is a sphere. The more seriously they take that pseudoscience.
Well, that's the thing. The seriousness is the problem here, I see, and how believing they are of the evidence in the first place. If your straight out position, big organisations like NASA are inherently untrustworthy because it's all propaganda and fake, the more and more they learn, I imagine through the principle you said of doubling down on opposite evidence, they would actually become more rigid in their belief structure. They would say, listen to all the stuff that they're lying about, it's not true. I'm not sure which way it'd go. I think actually it's probably more likely that they double down.
Do you really think so?
I think so. I think it depends on how far indoctrinated into the thing they are. If it's a person just first getting into it who has a bit of awareness of like logic and how these things work, it could go your way. But a person who's already convinced themselves that there is a big conspiracy and big government, big pharma, I don't know, whatever the scapegoat is of this particular person, I think it would go the other way.
Yeah, I mean that's a point we should focus on briefly. Is with this going against scientific worldviews, like I say, with it being a bit of a trend, I think it does come from a distrust. So when we're saying about rejecting the experts, the idea that NASA is this, this huge company, this huge corporation that are malicious and they're trying to deceive
Which is quite significant in being a corporation as well. I think that plays a lot into it.
I think there is a lot of distrust of authority and experts, and I think that's where you get flat earthers. I think that's probably its birth. Its genesis, I think, comes from a distrust of experts. But I mean, if we're getting, I think if we're going to try and keep it as focused as possible, we're interested in why do people distrust experts' opinions?
I think there is a lot to say on it. I'd want to take a very small aside and go a bit meta, maybe a bit philosophical. It's not too much of a leap to expect people to maybe see people who work in science, especially people who are in the media for science, as being part of a corporation in some way, being funded by someone. If you hear the anthropological idea that as groups get bigger and bigger, social cohesion breaks down and you're less and less trusting. So you tend to have a very small group of very close people who you trust with things you would never let anyone else do. Like you wouldn't let them walk around your house if you weren't there and stuff. But do you think that this idea of televised sciences and media giving statistics and stuff is in that same sphere of distrust? It's just one of these things right on the fringe of society that you are a fool to inherently trust, unless you're a person like us who very, very strongly value science.
I think, like you said, I think it's like if you break it down, it's like the other. If you
in groups
and out groups, like if you perceive somebody who is very highly educated on television, this person is probably wealthy, successful, they're an author, most likely middle class, if you want to bring class into it and all that sort of thing. And if you get somebody who is on a lower income position and isn't particularly from a family of people who value education massively highly, then you could see how seeing experts, as knowledgeable as they are on things you might even care about, let's say you have an interest in astronomy, you could still see these people whose job it is to tell you what's true as an outgroup, as people who you have nothing in common with, very, very little in common with, and perhaps that you could reject their ideas on that basis.
I think
it's a very human thing.
I think it's a very important point you just partly said there as well, is if you have an interest in things like astronomy, people who believe in flat Earth aren't people who don't care about space. They are people who are deeply interested in space and the world and stars and everything else. It's just they've come up with a very, very strange idea that they've originally focused on. So it's almost like they have a desire to know the things, but are just skipping the steps required to actually understand it, or at least not believing the people who have taken the steps to do it. Going back to this whole idea of rejection of the experts.
Yeah, and so you've got the distrust of outgroup, or people perceived as outgroup, as one of the reasons. You've got the fact that I think people's desire to be unique has them wanting to be part of this system of private information that only they're in exclusive groups. So I think these are big factors.
And I think another really, really big one that we should definitely talk about is science literacy and understanding and interpreting the information we're given.
Absolutely. So really this kind of brings us on to the final part of the podcast, which is clearly there is a problem with scientific literacy, and when you have groups of people that willingly and they take pleasure in dismissing experts' views on things. And huge groups of people that use pseudoscientific ideas such as reiki, homeopathy, you have to ask yourself, in a society that's interested in science and has done very well out of science, increasing life expectancy in medicine and all this kind of thing, it would be preferable. I think we can agree that it would be preferable if we could reduce a dependency on anti-scientific thinking and reduce a tendency for people to grasp for ideas that have no scientific basis.
Yeah.
So I thought something out of interest that we could do just before we address that is just quickly categorizing which sorts of pseudoscientific thinking are harmful and which ones are essentially innocuous.
For an example to get started off then, horoscopes and star signs would be pseudoscientific.
You're fairly safe in saying that astrology and horoscopes are pretty much harmless, pretty much. So if we think astrology is, what about Reiki?
I think, Reiki's a bit more of a difficult one, I guess, because as we mentioned before, there could be a more general practice of inviting energy into your body using meditation and various Eastern practices and things like that in a way that's absolutely fine. But there's a risk of personal and patient harm if you're using it as a mechanism to cure a disease that cannot be cured by invisible, inexistent energy.
If you're choosing it over cancer treatment, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially if you were to take your child who relies on you to protect them. If you were totally all about homeopathy and Reiki and that's your world, and you fully, in your head, you're helping your child by taking them to a Reiki practitioner. But if you're that scientifically illiterate that you don't recognize that there's no scientific basis, so you don't care to even ask the question of how useful it is, or you don't even know that what would constitute a scientific, what would give the green light scientifically for something. You know what I mean? Like, by what standard
if the good evidence actually hit you, you probably wouldn't even necessarily understand that is the level of evidence required. So this kind of maybe even harkens back, just a brief aside while we're on this area, harkens back to the ethics podcast a little bit. And if that is the case, and you have a child with, let's say leukemia, and you're a staunch anti-medicine, big pharma person who believes in Reiki, and that is the only way to save your child, and the doctor is 100% sure, or at least a significant degree sure, that they can save this child's life by stem cells or whatever the treatment may be, it's kind of a difficult ethical decision to be able to make.
It's an important question. But yeah, so just going through the list that we were going through, so we looked at astrology, basically harmless. Reiki looks to me as if it could be harmful. Same reason with homeopathy. And crystal healing's pretty much in that same bag. So I think the way I wanted to take this as a question, a general question, is should we want to eradicate all anti-scientific thinking even if it's harmless?
That's a good question.
So if we work on ways to increase scientific literacy, if you had the power to have people not read astrological, is the principle of scientific thinking so important that you would want to eradicate that sort of thing?
No, because I don't think they're necessary. I mean, they are at odds, obviously. They are definitely on different ends of the spectrum on thinking about the universe and how things work. However, with that said, outlawing people believing things is never, and probably will never, be a good idea.
No, I don't think you can.
Which I know that's not what you're advocating. However, the other side of it, increasing people's ability to understand science, and also having educators publicly out there showing what science is and what it can do. People like Brian Cox, Carl Sagan, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, everyone.
And Dawkins to an extent.
And Dawkins, yeah, been fantastic.
He's done some good stuff.
I mean, they're all like personal heroes of mine. I think they have one of the most important jobs in science, aside from just generally doing research and cracking on with the problems, is showing people what science is, how it works, how they can get involved, and also bridging the gap, making it accessible to other people, making it not be overly confusing and a thing to be scared of. And absolutely,
it is good to see. But if we use the explanations in the section of the podcast where we talked about why people embrace pseudoscientific thinking, then you can, to round it all off and pin it down. If you wanted to increase scientific literacy and reduce a reliance on these pseudoscientific ways of thinking, then you can at least we know what to tackle. Like you say, one of the things we said about if an educator on TV or at your school seems like part of the out group, like we mentioned, then if we wanted to reduce pseudoscientific thinking, then one of the ways you could do that would be to make the people who teach science and whose job it is to manage the public understanding of science, make them more charismatic, less dry. But like you say, I mean, Carl Sagan's good for that.
I think science has a really bad image problem in schools, and I think because obviously the way schools work is we've got to get you ready for these exams and stuff, and quite often there's a bit of fun chemistry, you get to burn some stuff. Usually, quite often, as you say, it's kind of dry. And certain people get turned off. Certain people who might actually enjoy it later on in life when they have the time to use it as a hobby.
Yeah.
But I'd just like to clarify on what I mean by science literacy isn't knowing facts about science. It's not knowing what the different parts of a cell are or anything. It's being able to look at not scientific knowledge and information and be able to interpret that and take it in as a thing that you can then learn from. I think that's much more vital a skill to give people than just lots of science knowledge that they might never use again. One of the key things I'm really, really interested in, and I think I know lots of people who do research and get really wound up about, is the publication of abstracts and little bits and pieces from studies in big media, into newspapers and stuff, where they basically take a little fact or maybe even the actual findings of the study, but butcher it and tailor it and dress it up in such a way to make a big headline that actually the real study did not mean that at all.
So you mean, like, for example, you see a headline that says scientists make immortal pig or something like that.
Something like that.
And so you think, wow, that's amazing. I'm going to read that, and you look into it, and they actually found, at the genetic level, they found using cells from a pig that they could make them replicate,
indefinitely with minimal DNA damage in a very controlled situation.
I think so. Is your point actually that way of like butchering science is an offence to scientific literacy?
It's strange. It's you imagine a study as a little blob of butter. Now, with that butter, you can either have it really, really dense and packed and have all the information, or you can spread it as far as possible across your piece of bread to cover as much as possible, but you lose all the detail behind it. Media is really good at getting the information out there, but the depth of the information is quite often lost. So when you say, is it a bad thing specifically? Not necessarily, because it can spread the news and get people interested. What's more important is equipping people to be able to then take that information, work out what the truths are, and then, more importantly, them being able to take that information, go off and find all the extra information they want to from that area and spark this amazing kind of like...
I mean, I think even more fundamentally, if you could only take one thing from all of the things we've talked about, really it's about critical thinking, right?
100%.
So somebody needs to be able to be, if someone's told something, ideally they want to ask, hang on a minute, how was that? Someone is told a piece of information, accepting it uncritically is, well, it's pretty much the first step towards becoming embroiled in a pseudoscientific idea. Yeah. If you accept something because it sounds good or feels good without being critical of it,
it's drama rather than...
it's your emotional connection to that idea, and it feels like you want it to be right, so you believe it. I think if you could, like you say, it's not about necessarily teaching about scientific knowledge necessarily, but if you can teach the paradigm of science, the scientific method, what constitutes good science practice, and how to tell if you're being manipulated, whether or not the outcome of something. Because honestly, as exciting as science can be, often at the level of the research paper, really science can be quite laborious at times. And just in its carrying out, I appreciate that can be a barrier to understanding the finer details.
Which I think is one of the final reasons I think we should discuss is of why people necessarily don't trust science as it is because when you start looking into it, you realise that lots of, well, maybe even most scientific studies don't come up to anything. Science isn't a series of eureka moments. It's a whole tirade of failures, and then one ever so slightly small positive result, which we then look at the methodology on and build on until we get more and more positive results. And I think one of the ways that we get to mistrusting, well, people may get to mistrusting experts, is hearing all these claims that are doctored to make them sound incredibly amazing, world-changing discoveries that aren't. They're just little bits.
That is a misrepresentation of science, in fact. And I suppose, along with what we've already spoken about, a misrepresenting of science as a discipline that will always have these breathtaking ideas, only to find that when in your own experience of science, actually it's a lot more meticulous and process driven and precise. It could be one of the reasons why people embrace less scientific ideas when they find that the truth is different.
I think a conversation for another time. We go into talking about the problems that science is facing right about now, especially in the social sciences, statistical value testing, and how quite a lot of findings that we've been taking for absolute definite laws about psychology actually might not necessarily hold up in retesting, which has been a bit of a discussion point in the media a few years ago. It's kind of settled down, but actually in science, it's still very much I think we're worried about the replicability of studies.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do a talk on some of the problems that science, and more specifically psychology, is facing. Yeah. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider subscribing.
You can also follow us on Reddit and Twitter.
Thanks for listening.